October 1984 saw the release of Terminator into theaters, the assassination of India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and the provisional IRA's failed attempt on the life of Margaret Thatcher. In the United States, it was the peak of the Reagan years, with Reagan's 49-state landslide re-election victory against Walter Mondale coming just the next month. One story that did not make the news that month, though, was an American Lockheed C-141 Starlifter on a secret mission to Islamabad, Pakistan. On board was William Casey, Reagan's Director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA, en route to a meeting with the Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI, Pakistan's main intelligence agency. At age 71 and having served in the U.S.'s intelligence apparatus since World War II, Casey was what you might call old school. Casey's executive assistant at the time, Robert Gates, who himself would go on to serve as Director of Central Intelligence under George Bush Sr. and head the Pentagon under both George Bush Jr. and Barack Obama, described that Casey had not come to the CIA with the purpose of making it better, managing it more effectively, reforming it, or improving the quality of intelligence. Bill Casey came to the CIA primarily to wage war against the Soviet Union. The focus of Casey's meeting in Pakistan was the war in Afghanistan, where, at the time, the CIA and ISI were covertly supporting the Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviet Union and the Soviet-backed government in Kabul. But beyond this, the agencies also discussed the broader topic of the Soviet Union's inability to deal with the Afghan Mujahideen and whether such a dynamic could be replicated elsewhere. For years, Western intelligence had seen Islam and communism as fundamentally incompatible forces, and believed where Islam grew, communism would wither. Indeed, 68 years prior, the Basmachi movement had revolted against Russian and then Soviet domination in Central Asia, resulting in a multi-decade conflict and tens of thousands of deaths. The Soviets' violent quashing of the Basmachi movement and the subsequent Sovietization and forced secularization of Islamic societies across Central Asia had profoundly reshaped the social order of those communities, all well within living memory, leaving many scars, mental, physical, and spiritual, all across the region. In the words of Adib Khalid at Carleton College, the West viewed the Soviet Muslims as the U.S.S.R's soft underbelly, invoking Churchill's characterization of Italy during the Axis domination of Europe in World War II. Just months before his visit to Pakistan, Casey had heard reports from CIA agents in Moscow of a lecture warning Soviet citizens of the potential for Islam to cause civil unrest in the Soviet Union. Around the same time, U.S. diplomats had reportedly been traveling around Soviet Central Asia looking for any potential recruits that might be able to liaise between the U.S. government and subversive movements on the ground in Muslim communities. However, the KGB had apparently been one step ahead of the Americans, and their efforts were unsuccessful. So, instead of directly connecting with specific contacts or recruits on the ground in Central Asia, the CIA hatched a new plan. At their meeting with the ISI, they proposed smuggling books across Afghanistan and into Soviet Central Asia about Central Asia's cultural histories and the Soviet Union's atrocities in the region, hoping to bring about a new wave of nationalist fervor like had been seen in the 1910s and 20s. Casey is quoted by one person who attended the meeting as saying, "We should take the books and try to raise the local population against them, and that the Muslim population could do a lot of damage if they were so motivated and so mobilized." The ISI had a different idea. Perhaps we can send them Qurans translated into their local languages, inspiring a rebirth of Islam in the region and prompt an Islamist uprising. The CIA supported the ISI's Quran proposal and hired an Uzbek man living in Germany to translate the Quran into Uzbek so that copies could then be smuggled from Pakistan through Afghanistan and into the Soviet Union. Just a few months after the secret meeting between the CIA and the ISI, thousands of Uzbek translations of the Quran were en route to Pakistan. By early 1985, the ISI had smuggled about 5,000 Qurans through Afghanistan and, apparently, into the Soviet Union. Now, the next part of this story comes with a lot of caveats. Namely that secret discussions between intelligence agencies 40 years ago don't have a ton of publicly available documentation to use for reference, and the information we do have tends to be the result of singular first-hand accounts filtered through the biases and agendas of the person recounting them, who themselves is a member of an intelligence agency. What is known is that around the same time as the Uzbek Qurans were being smuggled into the Soviet Union, Afghan Mujahideen started conducting more and more cross-border operations into the Soviet Union itself. According to Pakistani intelligence's head of operations in Afghanistan at the time, Mohammad Yusuf, these actions were the result of William Casey's prodding. Yusuf quotes Casey as telling Pakistani intelligence, "You can also think of sending arms and ammunitions if possible," in the context of the Quran smuggling operation. Robert Gates, Casey's executive assistant, seems to have confirmed some of Yusuf's account, claiming that the Afghan attacks inside the Soviet Union took place, quote, with Casey's encouragement. Steve Cole, whose 1992 Washington Post article, Anatomy of a Victory, CIA's Covert Afghan War, and 2004 book Ghost Wars constitute essentially the entirety of what is known about this episode in the public sphere, notes that if Casey spoke the words Yusuf attributed to him, he was almost certainly breaking American law, as no one but President Reagan possessed the authority to foment attacks inside the Soviet Union. And indeed, other U.S. officials who worked with Casey have argued that Yusuf's account is an exaggeration, or a misremembered account of the ISI's independent decision to support Afghan attacks in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, until and unless the CIA's records on this matter are declassified, we may not get any further details. So, did the combined Mujahideen attacks in the Soviet Union and smuggled books bring about a jihad against Moscow and Central Asia? No. No, they didn't. In fact, at the same time all this was going down, the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War was already being heralded, not in Central Asia, but in Moscow, where Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985. In May 1988, the Soviet Union began their withdrawal from Afghanistan, communist governments began falling across Eastern Europe the next year, and by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union was no more, with 5 new nations appearing on the map in Central Asia. But that's not the end of this story, because while the CIA's efforts apparently made no impact on the Islamization of Central Asia, Islam did indeed experience a rebirth in the region after the collapse of communist rule. As the governments of 90s and 2000s Central Asia have been predominantly secular nationalist regimes, Islamism in all of its forms, pacifist, political, and extremist, continues to be largely an opposition ideology, and one governments have been all too keen to use as a label for any and all those they view as causing trouble. So, what can we learn from this? Well, in my mind, the simplest lesson is that books and motive alone aren't going to mobilize a population against their government. You need some sort of organization, or at the very least some kind of immediate event to respond to for that kind of mass resistance to bloom. But beyond that, we can also see that for all the infamy of the intelligence agencies during the Cold War, even well-funded and well-resourced operations with 2 agencies from 2 countries behind them can still amount to not much. And this is even presupposing that, if successful, this operation would have been a good idea at all. Seeing how Afghanistan's situation deteriorated in the years following its war with the Soviets, it's not difficult at all to imagine a post-conflict Central Asia following in similar steps. What do you think? Was there any scenario at all where this was a good idea? Or did the CIA's failed plot end up working in their own interest in the long term? Let me know what you think in the comments.